Rajabov as we were expecting. And let's just see the last couple of moves, Robert, from when we left it. And it was at this move, queen to e7. And I wonder if that was the critical find by Gukesh to just neutralize all the pressure.
And queen d1 was the only move we found by process of elimination. We also have the evaluation bar. The player gave a question mark, but it did force a draw. Once f2 was captured, it was unstoppable checks. They agreed the queen will just go back and forth, and the king would go from b8 to b7. And if the king goes to d8 to d6 and so on, you cannot avoid the checks.
Really nice play there by Gukesh to make sure he doesn't get into too much trouble. I really liked that last move, queen e7, which forced this line. Well, not forced it, but at least made it happen on the board. And for Raja, I think he should be reasonably pleased with this result as well, because it keeps him in the mix for that first place. And the other players were in the mix for that first place. Pragnananda against Vidit. Let's quickly jump over to that board. When we left it, the big question was whose king is safer? The good news right now is that the queens have been traded off. Nobody is getting mated, but is a passer on the A line. Meanwhile, Vidit for compensation has got the bishop pair.
And the bishop pair always provides compensation. It's not that there's going to be attack against the king, but for example, bishop e2, bishops being long-range pieces, they can get across the board very quickly. Knights, as you mentioned, are bad at stopping rook pawns. Bishops can do an okay job. So bishop e2 is the big threat that Vidit wants. If the rooks get traded on e8, the black king will do the heavy lifting to stop that a pawn. I feel like this game is much more likely to be a draw than a win for white.
But I also feel if anyone can push this position, it's probably Prague here. Because that dark squared bishop on g3 is now free to target some of the pawns. It's that c7 pawn on the queen side and the h6 pawn, both currently on the dark squares. So he can look at creating some threats, but it is perhaps closer to a draw than a Prague win. It's fair to say that. Knowing Prague, he's going to try to grind this down. So it's going to be a long battle, but one game which isn't going to be a long battle against Hari Krishna. And let's quickly take a look at this before we go over to the tournament leader.
Oh goodness, there's a pawn on b7. So
it's supposed to be a black.
Shook against Gukesh, where Gukesh's pawn was all the way up on b7, but this is just completely over because white has an absolutely free hand. There's no attack against the white king. If you wanted to prepare, you could just slowly bring your rook and bring one to c8. This is very hopeless.
This looks busted, and also notice how that knight on d5 takes away all the key squares for black to actually put pressure on that b7 pawn, with the rook penetrating on the 7th rank and then doubling up on the c line and going ahead with rook c8. It almost feels like a plan that's hard to stop. h5, it creates a lift for the king, but no targets on the king side. This was a Nodebek show and a tough start for Hari Krishna today in the final day of the Rapid of the Tata Steel Chess India. The one player who's been on fire, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. He is in pole position, a half-point lead ahead of Rajabov, and it looks like he's going to extend that lead. Let's jump over to the endgame between Arjun and names, and there we have it. Look at this. He's dominating the board. Just compare each of the piece that black has, the pawns, and you just know who's the one playing for it. Gets awarded an exclamation mark, and that's because you end up winning another pawn on the board. But also that knight on e3, putting so much pressure on c2, tying down white's rook to defend that. I just feel that this should be a conversion that Maxime should be able to make.
There's almost no moves for white because rook g2 is a huge threat, whether or not it's check, and you can go rook g2. The king will slide to d3, so that's how Arjun is hoping to defend. But Tanya, a4, c4, c2, they're all isolated pawns in this position, and look at black's pawn structure. This chain of pawns means that white's pawns are stuck in place. There was one opportunity. I'm just going to go back. I think at this moment, white had to play a5 because if black takes here, at the very least, there are double pawns that you can go after. And if you can't play b5 because the c5 pawn was loose. So a5, I think, was white's last chance. And once we saw the trades, he went a5 as black, which the computer awards a question mark. Then was something perhaps a little bit better. But I think from a practical point of view, it's just completely hopeless for white. Just you're not going to survive a position like this against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave.
Well, he's given this check on g2. The king is on d3, and now it just feels that black has done everything right. But what is the way forward? Now, one thing that comes to mind is that if there's a check on this king, that would be really hard to meet because the knight on d2 will be hanging. So I think this last move, knight g4, explains just that. Also putting pressure on the clock. 2 minutes ahead from Arjun. Knight e5 is a threat on the board.
And I want to point something out, that chess.com doesn't just freely award exclamation points. It means that this was the only move to keep a huge advantage. So if we go back to this position and make any move, it looks like white can't do anything. You see the evaluation mark go way back towards the center. So knight to g4 was a very precise move here, threatening knight e5, as you point out. Knight f2 also. Oh, knight f2 is great because you're going to get discovered check against the king. So it does seem like this was the accurate reply that Maxime needed to help him extend his lead to a full point once he wins this game.
Just incredibly precise play by the French Grandmaster. I just want to point out, if white was to try and get active with the move knight to e4, you want to get your knight out of the way. This actually ends up in checkmate, knight e5, and it is game over. Look at the way the knight, the rook, and the d4 pawn are coordinating with such little material on the board. There are mating patterns when a white's king is on d3. Knight g4, I'm loving this move.
Fantastic play from Maxime. He's moving his knight in, it looks like, after knight f3, knight check. And where is the knight going to? That's the big question. Back to e4.
It's a nice square, but your king comes forward to d3. Does he want to just put that knight on c3 and start targeting the a4 pawn?
Yes, because if you defend the a4 pawn, rook g3.
Wow.
Just complete awareness and control from Maxime. And for Arjun, it's going to be a tough result here in the final day of the Rapid.
I just say with the black pieces, this has been flawless play by Maxime. From the middle game to the end game, just the transposition of the advantage that he had with the pawn structure, recapturing on e4 with that f pawn at a critical moment, advancing it to e3. He's just showing his class right now. And also we see Arjun has got under 2 minutes to defend a very difficult position. He's trying to give a check and slide the rook to f8 to defend that f3 knight. Amongst other things, a black can just simply start picking up the pawns, knight a4. But instead, he first targets the rook on f8. White has to keep it connected to the knight on f3. And I'm just expecting knight a4 here.
This king is in a checkmating net, so I would love, I can't, because the knight covers g1, but my point is I would love to get my rook to d1, as that would force knight d2 as a defense. So he's going for it. Yeah, he is going for it. He's saying that white can't move anything. Let me play rook h1, rook d1, and that should end in immediate victory for black.
And the a4 pawn can be picked up at any moment. There's no piece that white has that can actually defend that pawn. So instead, Maxime wants bigger things. He's going for the king.
I don't think there's anything that white can do to stop it. If you move your king out of the pin, the rook still goes back down to h1, threatening checkmate on d1. And Maxime looks like he is about to grab that rook, and he plays it. White is completely hopeless, frozen, no ideas of his own. And as you said, a4 can be captured whenever Maxime wants.
If white was to sacrifice the piece for the d4 pawn to try and fight the d1 mate, you can just pick up the a4 pawn at the end. You go back knight e1, then you can again just pick up the a4 pawn at the time that suits you. Once again, Maxime showing some top class chess in this one, not rushing with decisions, not playing the obvious move, but continuing to put pressure. Knight goes back, and now I think he's reaching for that queen side pawn, and the a pawn will be unstoppable. The black knight can also jump to b2 and say, you know what, I'm not happy with just one pawn, give me that c4 pawn as well.
Sometimes greed is good, it would seem, and taking the c4 pawn would give another extra pawn and a passer for black. So it's one single check from Arjun. It's an unfortunate game for him. Maxime just played the better chess.
He really did, and I think this one will go Maxime's way. Arjun's still going to fight it out till the end. He's of course a tricky player, but it's just that these kind of positions, it's impossible to create tricks. If it's a messy middle game where your opponent has the advantage, these youngsters, it's not over till it's over against them because they're so resourceful. But it's hard to even come up with a defensive idea or a trick in this position that could swindle the game in Arjun's favor.
There are none, and Maxime will go to clear first by a full point. And the thing about Rajabov's draw, when we said he wanted to take the safe approach, he plays Maxime in the final round. So if Raja wins his next two games, he will catch up to Maxime by default. So that's the good news for Timur, is that he's still in the running because he gets to play the tournament leader head-to-head in round 9.
But then he needs to make sure that he wins the next game to have a shot at that. Right now, it looks like Maxime is running away with this game. He comes back with that knight to c3, and now the a pawn will start marching down the board. The black king can move forward, but also find safety on the a6 square from the checks, and I think that's where the king is headed. King c7, so you just go king c6, king b7, king a6, and there are no checks in the position. I don't think this game is going to last more than a couple of moves.
White cannot move anything but the rook. If you move the king, you lose your knight. If you move your knight, you lose your king, because rook d1 is checkmate, just to show that this is actually checkmate. The pawn protects the knight and covers the e3 escape square. The knight protects the rook and covers that escape square, and the rook delivers the mate. So there are no moves for white here except with the rook.
And the rook also is going to run out of moves really soon. And we see there the king has landed on a6. Probably going to go back, rook to g8, trying to give a check on 8. This one's going to finish soon. Should we switch to another board, Robert?
Let's do it. We haven't looked at the chat involved, seeing if there would be time trouble for Grishuk. And he has more time than Keimer does, but this game did reach the end of its stages, and I think it's of rooks for white, but black has a knight and 2 pawns for that rook.
And the opposite color bishop complex, which gives black a lot of play on the dark squares, which can't be challenged either. So despite being an exchange down, I think all these factors give Grishuk enough play to maybe even start thinking about trying to go for a win at some point if white is careless. And yes, the clocks are level at the moment. But I have a feeling that Alexander Grishuk is pushing for more here. He is feeling ambitious. Why black can't allow g4, has to move forward with that. And maybe we can just show that what happened there. Actually, he resigned because after king e8, there's rook to d8 that finishes the game with a mate. And there was no way that black's king could have found any solace on the b8 square, because then the bishop comes to attack, and it's not an attack, it's game over with another checkmate. So really nice combination of the knight, rook, and bishop working together to get the king in a kill zone.
The activity, black's pieces, the rook in the corner, the bishop on f1, they're scattered. They could not help defend the black king. A nice win for Pragnanda in the end there. That was a complicated battle that he came out on top of.
And Arjun couldn't defend himself against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. That game has ended as we predicted. Maybe we can just see the last couple of moves. We see the final position. The a-pawn did find its way all the way down. Unstoppable with white's pieces just stuck. Look at that knight on c3 taking away all the key squares. You can't even go for this pawn. There's a fork on b1, and by the time white's king managed to get to c1, black's pawn was super protected and super close to queening a2, and that was it.
Very sad game there and sad finish for Arjun, but a great win for Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. We do have just 2 games remaining. Which one should we head to? No, Dirbek is still playing against Hari. That's also surprising.
And we should go to that because a lot has happened, and we had written this game off as Hari being busted, but it might not be the case. Let's do a quick material. Have 1 second. That has an extra pawn, and with no other pieces on the board, rook c8 is a far off dream to actually promote the b7 pawn.
So how did Hari survive? This is my first question. And he gives up a pawn with check here. What a big decision. This is so instructive. He recognized that if he took on f3 and this king takes on f3, the king is too quick. It's not about the pawn count. It's about the pawn race. And because this pawn on g7 is captured, the black king goes to f5. You can't get away with taking on g4 without dropping b7. Such amazing recognition from Hari. He's had a tough event. He had a horrible position. But just like Vincent fought back against him, he's fighting back against Nodirbek.
But I really want to see how did he manage to fight back in this game, because Robert, it looked completely lost for black at some point, and we left it when we saw that there was this threat of rook to c7.
This was the position, and somehow the game did not conclude. Black continued fighting. The rooks are lined up. How in the world? 97 check, given the double exclamation point, something that players really only dream of typically. And oh, there it was. There it was. I'm going to go back in time. Queen to c3 apparently was the mistake. Queen f7 was the more precise move. He didn't play this because he probably thought queen d4. Black is active, but after rook c8.
Because the queen defends the b7 pawn laterally. So queen f7, not only threatening mate, but...
Since we left it, there was a mistake from Hari apparently, and the king goes to e3. And is there going to be some kind of zugzwang?
And I think clock tells that story because Hari's playing on second right now. It's not an easy endgame to defend. He has made a mistake, so you've got to keep the rook on the 7th rank. Is he considering taking on g4, giving up that b7 pawn? I don't believe that you'd have any winning chances if you trade.
No, it's like a rook h7. I think the problem is the black king can't keep the white king out of e4. After king f5, move the rook somewhere along the way, and then play king e4. So black is going to try to keep the opposition, keep the white king out of advancing, but rook h6 check followed by king takes e5. Is this a winning king and pawn endgame that we might see?
Because white's king is closer to black's g4 pawn, and you're talking about the line if you give it check, black's king falls back. You pick up the e5 pawn, rook b7, but the Valbar disagrees that black is in time to put pressure on the b3 pawn. And it looks like this will end in a draw, but it's so hard to see from that initial position.
And look at this. White queens first with check. But for those of you at home, this is a theoretical draw because if you try to keep the king away, the king hides in the corner. This would be stalemate, so the white king cannot venture closer.
Oh my
that
God.
would be a stalemate.
Robert, he's given a check on h6.
Oh
and
my
he
gosh.
picks up the e5 pawn. He cannot go into a king pawn endgame. Is it a draw after king e5, rook b7?
It looks like that king and pawn game is a draw, but there's still a win here. And because it's not king takes e5, look at Nodirbek Abdusattorov. He could take a free pawn in front of him, but what he recognizes is not about capturing that pawn in the center. It's about getting your passed pawn free. Amazing stuff from
Quality
Nodirbek.
of pawns here. He wants to pick up the g4 pawn so he's able to queen faster. And king f5, that move deserves more than one exclamation mark. And the difference in this king pawn ending will be if black was to take on b7, you trade off the rooks and you're so much faster because you've gotten to the right pawn. You trade the rooks after king g4, and in this line you're close enough to the e pawn for it to be any dangerous, but black isn't in time to get that a pawn to the critical a2 square.
That's right. White queens just a little bit too quickly. We're seeing just this. We'll let the players' moves do the talking. And Nodirbek, he should be able to find a victory here, but there are some tricks. Perhaps black king is trying to come to d5 and push this pawn. I'm not sure if it's in time. We need to do a one-by-one count.
And that's what king pawn endings are about. It's about calculation here. By Nodirbek, let's show that why king c6 was so important. You have to shoulder black's king to make sure that it doesn't arrive at the a8 square when black sacrifices the pawn.
If this king was on c8, it's a draw. But after king d8, king b7, you do not get in. So the white pawn is escorted by the king. And just one more thing here, that after, in this position, if king c5, this is a draw. Because after a4, pawn takes. Now when I go here, king b6, king c8, the problem is the boundary. Normally this would be a win if the pawn was in a different file. But on the rook file, the black king goes back and forth. And all this white pawn can do is get in front of the king, but can't get any further.
And when you fall back with the king to get that pawn further, black's king finds its way to that a8 square. But it was intense watching Nodirbek play those last couple of moves. And Sasha has got an extra bishop in the position. This should not be too difficult.
Yeah, before there was an extra minor piece for a rook. Now that rook has disappeared, so it's just an extra minor piece. But black had all these pawns that probably Vincent had to sacrifice his rook to stop them. And this should be very straightforward. Several reasons why.
So straightforward that Vincent doesn't. As that pawn on a5 is the right square, as the dark squared bishop on a1 queening, and of course Vincent has got no chances in this position. Alexander Grischuk takes the win.
4 points for him. I think he is, besides the blunder that he had where we saw the shock on his face, we haven't really tuned into too many of his games, but Alexander Grischuk beats the youngster, the teenager from Germany, the #1 from Germany with the black pieces. Now he has 4 points out of 7 games. He's doing very well.
Despite that one move blunder which can shake any mere mortal up to go on a tilt in the tournament, knight f2 in a winning position against Temu, giving up that action at the very end, the last day of the Tata Steel Chess Rapid, and going into the penultimate round. This is where we stand. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave with that impressive win against Arjun. He extends the lead by 1 point, Robert.
But as we pointed out, that Rajabov does get to play Maxime in the final round. So he trails by a point right now. As long as he can keep that separation, he can beat Maxime in the last game and tie him. But Maxime beating him, Vidit was very close, but nobody else has looked like they can take a full point away from him.
And the nightmare does continue for Arjun and for Hari Krishna in the tournament. Hari with that loss against Nodirbek. Nodirbek was just on fire in those last few moves. I would be scared.
Every single one is fantastic. Look at the top. Maxime, the tournament leader, is playing against Hari, who's at the bottom of the standings. Ooh, that's a tough one for Hari.
It's a tough one for Hari, but if he can just get back into form in these last two games, he can play spoiler right now to Maxime Vachier-Legras's game. We all know what a great player Hari is, just how strong he is, but he has had a tough game right now.
But there are tricks of the mind here. When you play